Every empire believes its money will last forever. It begins as something pure gold, silver, or promises backed by real production. Then, as ambition grows and debts multiply, the metal fades, the promises stretch, and the paper takes its place. Inflation is not an accident of history, it is history. For 2,000 years, every great civilization that mastered money eventually destroyed it by creating too much of it. Rome, France, Spain, Britain, Germany, and now the United States, each followed the same economic law. When governments print wealth faster than they produce it, value dies first, then trust, then empire. The story begins in Rome. In the 2nd century AD, the Roman denarius was nearly pure silver. It paid the legions, fueled trade across Europe, and symbolized stability. But wars on distant borders drained the treasury. By the 3rd century, emperors began reducing the silver content to pay troops without raising taxes. A coin once 95% silver became barely 5% within 80 years. Prices exploded, wheat rose 50-fold, wages couldn't keep up, and merchants refused imperial coins. Rome tried price controls, death penalties for hoarding, and even new currencies. Nothing worked. The empire's tax base collapsed. The army demanded more pay, and the spiral fed itself. By AD 476, the Western Empire was gone. It hadn't been conquered by barbarians alone, it had been eaten from within by inflation. 1,000 years later, medieval Europe repeated the pattern. Kings needed gold to fight wars but owned none, so they clipped coins, shaving tiny amounts of metal from each piece, then reminting the scrap as new currency. Every transaction spread the fraud a little further. By the 14th century, England's silver penny had lost nearly half its metal. Inflation followed, trade stalled, and social unrest grew. The mechanism was crude, but the result identical to Rome's. When rulers dilute money, they dilute trust, and trust is the foundation of civilization. The age of exploration made the process global. After 1492, Spain discovered mountains of silver in the Americas. At its peak, Spanish ships carried 200 tons of silver home each year. For a generation, Spain lived as if wealth were infinite. But so much silver flooded Europe that prices quadrupled within a century, the first recorded case of global inflation. Spanish coins lost value faster than they could be minted. Imports soared, industry withered, and by 1600, Spain was bankrupt 4 times in 40 years. An empire drowning in silver, starved for real wealth. The lesson should have lasted forever. It didn't. 300 years later, Britain made the same mistake, this time with paper. The gold standard had kept the pound strong for a century, but World War I forced Britain to suspend it. The Bank of England printed pounds to finance the war. Between 1914 and 1918, the money supply quadrupled, while the gold behind it vanished overseas. After the war, Britain tried to restore the old exchange rate, pretending the pound was still worth its pre-war value. It wasn't. Exports collapsed, unemployment spiked, and in 1931, Britain finally abandoned gold forever. The pound fell 25% overnight. For the first time in modern history, paper had replaced promise completely. The 20th century perfected inflation through technology. Governments no longer needed metal or printing presses. They needed only confidence and a central bank. In 1913, the United States created the Federal Reserve. Its job was to stabilize the dollar. Instead, it institutionalized inflation. The dollar lost 96% of its purchasing power in the next 100 years. The line on the chart is smooth and silent, a gradual decline that most people never feel until it's too late. Germany's hyperinflation in 1923 shows how fast the process can accelerate once trust breaks. Before World War I, 1 German mark equaled a quarter of a US dollar. By 1923, after years of printing to pay war reparations, a loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. People burned money for heat because it was cheaper than wood. The psychological damage was permanent. Within a decade, political extremism replaced reason, and the world slid toward another war. Inflation doesn't just destroy money, it destroys societies. In 1944, as World War II ended, the Allies designed a new monetary order at Bretton Woods. The US dollar, backed by gold, became the global reserve. Other currencies pegged to it. For a while, discipline returned. Then came Vietnam, the Great Society programs, and the temptation no empire resists to spend without limit because its money rules the world. By 1971, US gold reserves could no longer cover the dollars in circulation. President Nixon closed the gold window, turning the dollar into pure fiat currency. From that moment forward, every dollar in existence was backed only by debt and belief. The era of permanent inflation had begun. Between 1971 and 2025, the U.S. money supply increased more than 50-fold. Each crisis, the oil shocks, the dot-com bust, the 2008 meltdown, the 2020 pandemic, brought new waves of printing. What used to take centuries now happens in decades. In 2020 alone, $6 trillion was created from nothing. Consumer prices rose, but asset prices rose faster, hiding the real erosion beneath a stock market boom. The pattern is mathematically identical to Rome's coin debasement, just digital. Inflation always starts as policy and ends as panic. At first, leaders call it growth. Then they call it temporary. Finally, they call it someone else's fault. But the data never lies. When money supply grows faster than output, purchasing power falls. The only debate is how quickly. That speed is what turns slow decay into sudden collapse. By 2026, US debt will exceed $37 trillion and interest costs will approach $1.2 trillion per year. Even with moderate inflation, servicing that debt requires more printing. It's the same self-reinforcing loop Spain, Britain, and Germany faced. Inflation is not just higher prices, it's the destruction of measurement itself. Once prices change faster than wages, planning disappears. Investment halts, production falls. The state prints even more to cover the losses, and the cycle tightens. Halfway through every empire's inflation story comes the same illusion control. Central banks announce targets, economists publish models, and the public believes the experts have a plan. But the models assume discipline that politics cannot supply. Rome had the same illusion with its edict on maximum prices. It failed because you cannot legislate value when confidence is gone. You can only restore trust by stopping the printing, and no empire ever does until it's forced. If you're still watching, hit the like button and subscribe. Understanding inflation isn't just about economics. It's about survival. Empires come and go, but the people who see the pattern early are the ones who protect themselves. This channel exists to expose those patterns before they finish repeating. As printing continues, the illusion of control begins to dissolve. The first cracks appear in places most people never notice. Small banks tightening credit, foreign investors trimming US bond holdings, governments diversifying reserves quietly while saying nothing publicly. Then energy prices rise, food becomes unstable, and the average citizen starts to feel the erosion directly. It's not a sudden disaster. It's a slow-motion collapse measured in grocery bills and rent. History shows that this phase always ends the same way when belief breaks faster than statistics can explain it. By the time inflation becomes visible to everyone, it's already irreversible. Governments respond by manipulating the numbers, redefining how inflation is calculated, adjusting core prices or excluding volatile categories. Rome changed the weight of its coins. Modern nations change the weight of their data. Both methods hide decay, but never stop it. In late-stage inflation, what dies first is honesty. Between 2020 and 2025, global money supply grew faster than at any point in recorded history. The total worldwide debt, sovereign, corporate, and household, exceeds $300 trillion. That number is beyond comprehension. It's a claim on future labor that will never be delivered. The only way to maintain the illusion of solvency is to make each dollar worth less. To inflate away the promises. This is not a moral choice, it is arithmetic. Empires don't print because they want to. They print because they have no alternative. Tax increases cause revolt. Spending cuts cause recession. But printing creates the comforting illusion of both prosperity and peace. It works until it doesn't. When the public realizes that new money no longer creates new wealth, confidence collapses. That's the real moment. Inflation turns into destruction, not when prices rise, but when belief ends. The social cost is predictable. Savings lose value, middle-class families drift downward, and inequality explodes. The rich own assets that rise with inflation, the poor hold cash and wages that lag behind. Resentment grows. The state blames businesses for price gouging, businesses blame supply chains, and citizens turn against one another. The cycle of accusation replaces accountability. Rome experienced bread riots. Weimar Germany saw wheelbarrows of cash. Every inflation ends with anger before it ends with reform. Modern inflation has a new weapon: technology. Digital systems allow the creation and distribution of money instantly. Central banks can inject liquidity at the tap of a keyboard. It feels modern, but it's simply faster decay. The faster money moves, the quicker confidence erodes. Between 2020 and 2023, over 80% of all US dollars in existence were created. No empire has ever expanded its money supply so dramatically in peacetime. The effects are still compounding through the economy, like radiation through tissue. Slow, invisible, inevitable. Inflation also changes psychology. When citizens stop trusting their currency, they stop saving. When they stop saving, they stop investing. When they stop investing, productivity falls, forcing more money printing to compensate. The loop closes. Inflation becomes not a symptom, but the system itself. Once that shift happens, even honest policymakers are trapped. Every reform hurts too much to implement, so they delay until mathematics enforces the decision for them. The data for 2026 through 2030 already points in that direction. U.S. entitlement spending, Social Security, Medicare, and interest payments will exceed total tax revenue by the end of the decade. Even if discretionary spending dropped to zero, the nation would still run a deficit. That deficit must be financed. The only buyer large enough is the Federal Reserve, which means more creation of money from nothing. Inflation is no longer a glitch in the model, it's the model itself. Once that reality becomes public, the rest of the world adjusts. Foreign banks repatriate dollars, commodity producers demand other currencies, multinationals diversify reserves into gold, real estate, and digital assets. Every shift weakens external demand for dollars and increases domestic inflation. The process resembles an empire withdrawing its legions, quiet at first, irreversible afterward. When historians later describe this period, they will note that the end came not with collapse, but with acceptance. Politicians and citizens alike learned to live with moderate inflation, redefining it as normal. Rome's citizens did the same when silver disappeared from their coins. They called it the new standard. By the time the denarius contained no silver at all, few remembered what real money felt like. That psychological adaptation is the final stage before systemic break. At some point in every cycle, governments attempt drastic reform, price controls, wealth taxes, even new currencies. France tried it in 1793 with the assignats, paper money backed by seized church land. It collapsed within 3 years. China tried it under the Yuan dynasty in the 1300s, printing so much paper that rice prices rose 20-fold. The Ming that followed banned paper money entirely for 2 centuries. In 1990, Argentina, currency boards pegged the peso to the dollar. It bought time, not salvation. The pattern transcends culture, technology, and ideology because it is rooted in human nature. We always spend today what tomorrow must repay. By the end of every inflation, society faces a moral reckoning disguised as an economic one. The loss of value becomes a loss of truth. Contracts mean less, savings mean less, promises mean less. The collapse of money is the collapse of measurement itself. The inability to compare, to plan, to trust. Civilization depends on that trust. Remove it and people retreat into barter, hoarding, and fear. That is how empires die from the inside. The future will not look like Weimar Germany's wheelbarrows or Zimbabwe's trillion-dollar notes. It will look like slow decline, masked by digital abundance. Screens will show higher numbers, but those numbers will buy less each year. The illusion will persist longer than anyone expects because technology can disguise decay better than metal ever could. But beneath the data, the pattern remains the same. In the coming years, central banks will introduce digital currencies, programmable money designed to control velocity and spending. Officially, they'll be sold as tools for efficiency and safety. In reality, they're mechanisms to manage collapse, to ensure that when inflation erodes value, the system can still monitor and ration the flow of money. It's not conspiracy, it's control by necessity. When trust in value dies, authority replaces it with surveillance. None of this is inevitable in moral terms, but it is unavoidable in mathematical ones. Every empire reaches a point where its debt, interest, and entitlement curve outgrow its productive base. Printing bridges the gap temporarily, but each bridge shortens the next. Eventually, there's no bridge left to build, then history resets. The empire's currency devalues, assets reprice, and real wealth transfers from those who trusted paper to those who trusted reality. That's the story of inflation, a silent revolution that moves power from savers to debtors, from citizens to the state, from production to speculation. Over 2,000 years, the technology has changed from mints to presses to code, but the outcome has not. Inflation is not about economics, it's about time. It borrows the future to fund the present, and when the future arrives, there's nothing left to give. If you've stayed through this far, you already understand what most of the world refuses to face, that inflation is not temporary, and it never was. It's the mechanism of imperial decline written in numbers. If you want to see how this pattern ends, make sure to like this video and subscribe. The next episodes will go deeper into the final phase of fiat money and the rise of the systems that will replace it. History doesn't repeat, it compounds, and those who recognize the compounding early are the ones who survive it. So the next time you hear that inflation is under control, remember Rome's silver, Spain's gold, Britain's pound, and Germany's mark. Remember that each empire thought the same thing right before the end. Because the truth about inflation is simple, it always begins with optimism, and it always ends with arithmetic. And arithmetic, as history proves, always wins.